All right, welcome back. We're gonna have a little bit of fun today. We got some knives out here, and this video is about handle types. Handle types I like, handle types I don't. And I'm just gonna go straight to it and give you dessert first. This is one of my favorite handles on a knife that I've ever handled, pun intended. This is the 8022 from Demko. It's actually a prototype. Of course, I failed to deploy it. And it is going into somewhat of a custom production this week, actually, or the next week at Blade Show. They're going to kind of release what I'd call like a custom version of it made in the US, but this is one of those original runs, number 9. Always carry a knife. Yeah, and I really love the handle on this, and I'm not 100% sure why. I think it's because the front 2 fingers get this nice little embedded grip area, so that's comfortable. The back, a slight arch. Sides of the scales have this really cool, I'll zoom in a little bit on that for you, have this really cool sculpting on it. So it's got a little bit of texture in there, but it's not too sharp on the edges. Everything just is right on this handle. And then on the back side, it pops out a little bit, but then so this is maybe even a little too high for me, I'd say. It probably could just be flatter through there, but then it heads back down at the end for that pinky. That pinky's your smallest finger, and yet I've seen knives, and I'll give an example right away, where that is actually bigger at the end, which doesn't make any sense, just given the shape of your hand. Similarly, if you look at the inside of the cup of your hand, and everyone's hands are different, some are flatter, some are more curved, you really want this to be either flat or arced in the back. I've seen some knives that are arced the other way, and they're really uncomfortable in hand. So that Demko 8022 stands out as one of my favorite knives in hand. And yeah, that design works really well for me personally. Now I'm going to jump to like one of the worst ergo knives. It's not the worst, but it's one of the worst that I've actually decided to keep in the collection. You can see there's some elements that are similar here where you can kind of get into it, but look at that on the pinky and this flatness in the back where it ends up, actually end up kind of pointing into my hand a little bit here. This thing just makes no sense. This is the Strider SMF. And although it's an interesting knife and kind of cool in its own right, made here in the US, that handle is not something I would enjoy. You can even see the gap right there and why I'm getting the hot spot here in the corner of my hand. So that'd be on the other end of the spectrum of something that, this one's something that's actually stayed in my collection for a few months, but that's certainly an undesirable design. One that stands out to me also is the Oz Roosevelt. In its size, it's unmatched in my experience. I've never found a knife that feels quite so comfortable. Again, you get that slight arch on the back. You've got these 2 finger choils. In this case, they've kind of like integrated the front finger choil, so you don't carry it back here. You always hit this knife right here. You don't need another choke up point. It's just right. It gets slimmer here at the end again. So it's kind of similar to this, but it's a really different execution if you think about what they're doing. You can see how if I shift this backward a little bit here, there's a lot of similarities right on where things line up for where your finger goes. So man, I don't know if it fits everyone's hand the same, but this thing feels like, it was like almost custom designed for my hand. One of the things I love about this is the forward choil still has handle on either side, so it's full width. It's actually the most comfortable part of the grip, whereas in a lot of knives it's the least comfortable, but that's like, to me, one of the most important spots that you grab on your knife. So really interesting. Now, on the other end of the spectrum again, something that sort of does things a little differently. Now, it does have a decent arch in the back, and again, this is something that is in my collection, and this sort of ends up sort of almost, what's the right term, synthetically or virtually tapering because of the angle that you hold it at. But this knife's this is the Brian Brown Raptor, a little too skinny for me. So like up here where my fingers are biggest, they totally overlap the knife. And then this, your pinky ends up kind of hitting right. I mean, you can kind of get it in there, and then it's not a problem. But you kind of want to either be totally choked up or like choked back on it. Because if you're right on that edge there, that's pretty uncomfortable for your pinky. And then your pinky ends up being the only one that like kind of can't overlap it. It's just a really weird ergonomic. It's to me like the weakest part of a very cool knife. That's very nice action and stuff. It's a cool knife, again, enough to stick around in the collection for a few months, but definitely on the lacking. Now here's a totally different approach. The WE Banter, where it does end up getting a little bigger at the back, but for some reason it just works. And I don't really know why that is for me. Maybe it's because it's still pretty small overall back here, but it does sort of hold your hand into a pocket really nicely. You don't need a choke up point. It's just a very efficient knife in terms of length that I find quite ergonomic and really enjoy the feel in hand when I'm using it. There's never a point where I feel it's not like super comfy. You get a little hot spotty here again in the pinky, but like you never really feel out of sorts with that, which is nice. Now, again, almost the opposite of that to some degree is the CGRB Echo, which is a Ray Laconico design. And you do get some of the swoop in the back, but it's almost like too flat here and too rounded back here, and then you got a flat across the front. You get a little finger choil there. But this one, kind of like, if this whole hump was maybe shifted forward a little bit, it might work a little better. But to get it in the right spot, you just kind of got to be in a weird spot. It's a little off. It actually works quite well, all things considered. Again, it's a knife I decided to keep in the collection, but I do prefer the handle on the Pyrite, its predecessor. I feel like this was a little bit of a step backwards for them in terms of the ergos, but it does some other things in a pretty good way. However, look at this CGRB Pyrite. A little simple, all things considered, but I kind of like it. I talked about how maybe it would make sense to kind of flatten this out here, like it's almost a little too much. This thing, you can just grab, and it just never feels like you're going to grab it the wrong way. Again, stays slim, at least at the end. This one doesn't really have a taper at the end, but it doesn't really need it. Quite a good feel in hand on this guy. It's simple, but it works. On the other end of the spectrum, again, a knife that's cool enough to be in the collection, the Triaxis Midnight. Some really nice action on this thing, and it's kind of a competitor to the Rosie or the Olemic Whisper, essence there. But it's very hot spotty. It's got some, very sharp edges. It feels almost like these edges, I don't really know how to explain it, but like in here on the inside and here, they need to be knocked down more. And, you couldn't really do it probably with the way he puts the screws right against the edges here, which is unfortunate because I feel like the way that this kind of digs in here at the back, kind of digs into my hand, and this doesn't quite get small enough for the pinky, and the front feels a little bit cramped. It's just, I've never found like a really super comfortable grip on this knife. It's a big part of why I've never actually carried it. Really cool knife. I think it, it does some things really well, but not something that I carry. Let's go to a classic, but there's a reason for it, and that's the Benchmade Bug Out. This is kind of different, but similar to the WE Banter. You can see this one kind of swoops up in the middle, but overall, this overall swoop, like if you took this down, they're similar in size. And I think you can get away with that on this one. And it ends up gripping pretty well now. If it had some better scales, these are a little sharp on the inside, and there have been many a complaint over the year on how Benchmade's done those scales, but man, that's a really just ergo grip, and one that's pretty damn good. Pretty damn good there. Also an interesting knife, one that made it to the table, but definitely has some oddity to it, is this guy. And part of the reason it's here is because in this grip right here, it's amazing. Like, that's basically everything that we just talked about. In this grip right here, it still works because this kind of makes it to the end of your hand almost, so it doesn't really bite in too much. This one happens to be the Dama version of it, but the Evo has quite a good ergonomic to me. It's always sort of stood out as being one that feels quite good. This has that similar kind of thing with the Rosie where you've got quite a bit of grip there in the forward choil. So yeah, one that made the honorable mention, but it almost is a little counterintuitive just based on the way it's designed. You'd think it would kind of fall into this region, but you can see how the differences in where he cut it out backwards here make a really big difference. The forward choil up here, this is similar, but these differences, and see how this cuts out, this needs to cut back, you know, make a really big difference in the knife. Now where the pivots are positioned and stuff change what you can and can't do. But yeah, that one was interesting to me, that when I was going through the collection, that it sort of stood out as one that felt pretty good. Very dissimilar, but again, getting back into somewhat of this design, but on a slightly bigger scale, would be the SPK Lamia by Alex Steingraber, I think is his name. Forgot the exact spelling or sounding of his name. I don't think I've ever said it out loud, actually. But this thing is quite good. You would think almost it was a little skinny, kind of like the Brown, but it's just wide enough where it ends up feeling pretty darn good. And they did a really nice job of tapering the edges. But you can see how size-wise and generally there's a lot of similarities to that Brian Brown Raptor, but just less of this extreme swoop. That swoop was too extreme on this one and kind of took away from some of the ergos that this one seems to have retained. It's definitely not the best ergo I've ever handled, but it's very good. One of the others, this would be, again, going to a very different version, but this is the 8020. This is a custom compact, and it's not quite as extreme on these lines as the full size. Let me pull that out and you can kind of see the difference here. Here's the full size. It's actually the same handle, but it's been manipulated into this compact version. This feels really good too, don't get me wrong, but some of these grips just feel a little off. This feels pretty damn good, but like this choke up point, like my hand's just kind of all over the place. Whereas on this one, I feel like the choke up point, this grip, everything feels pretty damn good. So that's one they've kind of like done like a double swoop here. This thing's pretty wild how they carved that out. That stands out to me as one that does have a pretty damn good grip on it. Now coming out of South Africa here, you have the A2 knives. I think this one model is called like the A10, or maybe it has some other code name or something. But this thing is a pretty cool knife and a very different approach to doing. I'm trying to think of which one does something kind of like this. I guess it's quite different than all the others. You can see it sort of comes out and it doesn't really pop back out at the end like a lot of the other knives here do. But man, this thing, you get it in hand, it feels really good. It's got nice, you know, it's not a huge amount, but it has just a bit of, you know, convex to it, I think is the right term. Tapered, you know, on the handle, and it just does a really nice job. You can actually flick this guy this way too, which is kind of cool because it's like a high front flipper. But yeah, it's just got a little bit of these lines and everything just feels pretty good. Now on the back, rather than being round, there's a couple little peaks here that I probably don't love. You don't really notice them, but if I were to design it, I'd probably not take those straight lines. I'd probably just round the whole thing off. I guess it would change the look of it a little bit, but to me, it'd probably feel best in hand that way. This thing holds pretty darn good though. What is that getting down to? I think that's covered everything but the Brown Mini FSD. Again, you see a bit of the element of this style here where you're popped out at the front and then you kind of swoop in, out, and then back down at the end. And yeah, this one feels pretty damn good in hand. You can choke up on it again. Not the best choke up feeling because this is kind of rounded out instead of rounded in. If you had, you know, swooped that back a little more, it's got like a little bit of flattening there, you can see, for the finger, but just not the most comfortable in that position. But man, in this position, it feels pretty freaking good. Yeah, a really nice ergonomic on that knife too. So yeah, just some food for thought. You can see what I gravitate towards out of this sort of really three designs. One is just a flat swoop in either flat back or round back. The other one is, you know, in and then out and then back in. The other one is this sort of one in and then one down. So like one big swoop in for the front two fingers and then down tapered for the back two. And then some of the ones that have more of your hand, you know, entirely cut out into here, kind of trying to nail your hand size and shape perfectly in the knife. So those, you know, I could kind of say this one would do that a little bit as well, and this one. So yeah, some food for thought on blade handles, on knife handles, that puts you in a really good position to manipulate the blade and just feel like you're gripping it in a comfortable way. That's confidence invoking. So yeah, all for now. Please like, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care.